Hello, I am Robert Galloway, and welcome back to a new week of First Presbyterian Church's Formation on the Go. I hope you have found these videos helpful as we follow along with the summer preaching series. This week, we are beginning a new series that is following Bright Hope for Tomorrow. We kicked that off this past Sunday with an exploration of Hebrews 11, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Throughout this series, we are going to be looking at Old and New Testament scripture, focusing on what each one says about hope. And as I hope you have found this video and the weekly emails helpful as we study together and individually, you can always find more resources to aid in your study and understanding of each week's scripture by visiting our Pathways to Discipleship website at fpcpathways.com. Before we begin looking at this week's scripture, I want to ground or frame this series a little bit. As we discussed with the I am statements of Jesus Christ, as we looked at them in the Gospel of John, each statement, each I am statement revealed something unique, a unique idea or a unique image of Christ and his ministry. Now, we know Christ isn't limited by one of those images or all seven of those images combined, but they just give us a glimpse into Christ's nature. And I want us to keep that in mind as we study these various passages about hope. It will be important to ask yourself, what unique or new aspect of hope does this give me? Does this teach me? Or maybe it's not so new as it sort of reminds you of something you know about hope. It won't be the all-encompassing understanding of hope, but each passage should help reflect an aspect of hope. Hope is so big and deep that I challenge you to expand your understanding or question your knowledge of hope throughout the study. All right, well, this week we are looking at various scriptures, various verses of scripture in Hebrews 11 and a little bit of 12. Hebrews is one of my favorite books of the Bible. It really helps us understand the figure of Christ and the new covenant, and that God is making with us in and through Christ. This book or letter gets its name from the audience to whom it was first written. This group of people were either Jewish people who had converted to Christianity in their lifetime, or maybe they were first or second generation Christians. And of course, it could have been a mix of the two groups. But it definitely was a group of people who would have been familiar with Jewish tradition and laws. A lot of Hebrews talks about the great high priest and sacrifice. So obviously, these people knew a lot about temple sacrifice or had witnessed it, or maybe their parents had told them about it. The other thing to know about Hebrews, just in general, and really kind of specifically as we jump into this text, is that this is a sermon that is written to be heard. Definitely would have been preached to these people. And as you know, and trust me, I know, sermons can't do all the things all the time. They are not lectures, thankfully. They are not papers that we read out loud from the podium, although some of our youth may disagree. No, what they are not theological treatises. At some point, at some places in this sermon, the book of Hebrews, the preacher is trying to inspire rather than perfectly explain some of his theological claims. So try to take that in mind. We're not going to get the all-encompassing definitions or thoroughly explain, thought out theological ideas that you would in maybe John Calvin's Institutes. But here we're having a sermon, so there's going to be some broader claims that will help us kind of inspire and get us through these ideas. And I say that because in chapter 11, it opens with a definition of faith. It says, faith is which is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And many theologians have remarked that this is an incomplete definition of faith. But as we said, this is a sermon and not a seminary lecture. So the preacher is crafting an effective working definition of faith that will serve the immediate need here. This definition shows that faith already possesses in the present what God has promised in the future. So it possesses in the present what God has promised for the future. This is partly as well, faith is partly an inward reality and partly an outward force. It is inward confidence and assurance of all that God has promised, but it is an outward force, or it is outward action that leads us to serve the world and serve the people for God's will and God's promise. This definition also describes what faith can see. It says the conviction of things not seen. Faith can see realities that are not visible to our regular eyes. It can see the creation and order in the chaos of the universe. Faith can see the reality that Christ is Lord and supreme over the world, even when we may see sin, suffering, setbacks. But the truth is, we know that Christ is taking care of us. Then the majority of this chapter, chapter 11, is when the preacher goes into a list of faithful people of the Old Testament and what they achieved by faith. We're not going to explore a lot of that in detail right here, but I'd encourage you to read through verses 4 through 38. Ask yourself, which are the stories that are familiar to you, like Moses and Abraham? What are some of the ones that are less familiar, like maybe Gideon or Barak, and maybe explore their stories in scripture this week as you go about your study. What is unique about each one of their faiths? And I would encourage you to take time to maybe select a few this week, just look at one or two each day, and just sort of refresh your memory of what their story is and how maybe their faith or their hope can influence you or inspire you that day or this week. Then in verse 39, we pick up again, and the author says that they were commanded by their faith. They were commended for their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, that God had provided something better. And as we know, that better thing was Jesus. And a lot of times this line is, verse 39 is kind of problematic for people. It's really confusing. But the thing is, we have to remember is the author, and one thing when you read Hebrews as a whole, you'll hear this a lot, is the author uses the word better in connection with Jesus as a refrain throughout Hebrews. The author says Jesus is better than the angels, a better hope, a better covenant, better promises, better sacrifices, inheritance from God, meaning Jesus is better. So when we hear the word better, we think Jesus. So these faithful people of the Old Testament before Jesus were leaning forward in hope, waiting for a better resurrection. Their hopes could not be fulfilled until the Son came and died, and we are leaning forward in that hope until he comes again. Their hope was strong, and even though they could not see what was to come, so that God isn't reneging on any hope or promises to them, but he has promised something better. So, and then in the author, we sort of jump into a little bit into chapter 12. It says, in the great cloud of witnesses, that is how we are connected to these people. Even though our hope is rested in the truth and the knowledge of Christ, it can be the same hope that helped Abraham and Moses and Rahab and all the others that had the same kind of faith and hope. We can lean forward in hope just like them. Leaning towards what is better and what is promised to us will fulfill and sustain our hope. We are all connected in this long arching hope that comes from God and rests on the truth that is Jesus Christ. I hope that this kind of inspires you or kicks you off into a great week of study. Definitely check out all of chapter 11 and the very beginning of chapter 12 of Hebrews. The resources on the website will also help fuel and get you through some of your study this week. As always, if you have questions about that, please reach out to me, Robert Galloway, or Gerald Kiesler, our Director of Adult Formation. Thank you so much, and I look forward to joining you next week.